are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second part of the series, Commercial Solar Peaker Batteries Part 2. Once again, my name is Andrew, and I'll be moderating. Remember to anyone who might just be joining us to make sure that you are logged into the webinar through your own connection. This is required so that we're able to accurately prove your attendance. Also, it's the only way for you to gain access to the quiz at the end of the program, which is required if you're trying to obtain continuing ed credits. I'd also like to remind everyone that if you have a question for our speaker during the webinar, to please see the dark gray questions bar that's in the panel to the right of your screen. This is how you'll be able to ask your questions. Please feel free to ask any questions at any time, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. If by chance during the webinar you should happen to lose sound through your computer speakers, there is an audio tab option in the panel and you can use your telephone. For anything else that might come up, please call Halfmoon's customer service at 715-835-5900, and I'll post that number again for everyone in the chat section. With that being covered, excuse me, I'd like to hand the microphone over to our speaker for the series, J.R. Cromer.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. What we're going to start out with is talking about specific design issues related to commercial solar projects, and kind of some tips and tricks to look out for. Then we're going to transition to a discussion about community solar, which I think complements commercial solar batteries very well, in that there's a lot of people who want to fund solar projects but can't do it on their home or business for whatever reason. Low electricity prices, bad solar policy, shaded rooftops. There's lots of you rent instead of you buy. Lots of high level reasons why someone might not have solar on their rooftop. And here we have commercial solar batteries that are quite expensive, but have economic paybacks that are within their lifetimes, and can have paybacks that are better than solar. And so, what if you combine the two? What if you built a commercial solar battery and then converted it to a community solar project? Okay, so what we're looking at now in commercial rooftops is rapid shutdown requirements that require the array perimeter to de-energize during a power outage. And so, primarily now you're going to be putting, these are little rooftop optimizer boxes that are put along the edge of the array. If you're on the most recent National Electric Code updates, you now need to start putting these behind the solar panels themselves to meet rapid shutdown requirements. Now, from about 2017 back, there's interpretations where you could say, well, maybe that's not what's intended, but the code has been driving towards module level shutdown on rooftop applications for some time now. I think one of the problems that I see most in solar with commercial rooftops have to do with the proximity of the solar array to the roof, for lack of a better word. Let's see here. I got a question. Maybe not. I think that might have just been a chat. Okay, let's get back on track. Is the proximity of the solar array to the rooftop. And what I mean by that is the solar panels have wires coming out the back of them. And these wires have to connect to their next door neighbors. So they're, being strung up from module to module to module. And yes, there are cable management clips to put up underneath the module. But a good solar rack has a clear idea for cable management. When the modules go from module to module, are they just going underneath from one frame to the next, or are they being better managed somehow? And this becomes an even larger issue when the arrays get larger and larger, like a big commercial rooftop solar array. So the what comes to mind lately has been Tesla and some stories about fires breaking out on the rooftop. Well, what causes a solar array to catch on fire? Well, for one, there is an element of politics behind it. A lot of solar cities, solar leases written 7 or 8 years ago were for 22 cents a kilowatt hour or more, very expensive rates. And so, if one thing goes wrong at one Walmart, they might look at that as a, tool to renegotiate the entire portfolio of solar leases. Well, that's still, one fire, one warehouse burning down because of solar on top is still not, acceptable. So I guess what I would say is be wary of the bottom of the shelf solar racks out there because they don't give much thought to cable management. I mean, this module corner right here on this ballast pan sits, right flat on the rooftop. So the edge of the solar array is about right there, just an inch or so up off of the roof deck. Now, I've seen commercial rooftops that are flat, and when it rains, over an inch of water accumulates on the rooftop. I've seen commercial rooftops where the drains have levees built around them so that the entire roof water cannot make it to the drain, more or less. And so, putting the solar modules just inches from the surface of a rooftop uh, might be fine in sunny California or the desert where it doesn't rain all the time. But what we did on a commercial rooftop in Mississippi is selected a racking system that was a little bit heavier. Definitely felt that installing it. It was heavy to pick up these beams and walk them around and set them down and adjust them and move them. It was manual labor. It was hard work. But the end result is you get standoffs coming out of the rooftop, and then conduit pipe blocks, although these are very robust pipe blocks, lifting the kind of sub rack up off the rooftop before putting the broader rack on top. The end result being the module is a good you know 1.5 to 2 feet up off of that roof deck. And so the problem is there's a couple of problems. There's a cable management problem where these solar cables, they need to hop from one row to the next, but then they also need to hop from one row to the next row. And so if you don't have any mind to cable management, you're asking for that circuit underneath the module to be drug underneath this panel, which again is only going to be an inch or so up off the rooftop. Now, when you start getting lots of home run circuits kind of being strung outside of conduit, and keep in mind solar cable is rated to be outside of conduit. So if you're pulling a lot of outside of conduit and cable together, that cable is going to sag and touch that roof deck. And in addition to temperature derate implications of that, then there's also the I think the more severe implication of, well, what happens when a rooftop when those conductors get water on them, the water can start climbing up the cable and cause equipment failure. And so that's why on rooftops there are cable management solutions either integrated into the railing, or ultimately you need to get cable tray to carry that cable back along the rooftop. And cable tray can be surprisingly expensive. So it can be very tempting to say, well, let's not do cable tray. Let's just carry all the cable out from the edge perimeter and put it into conduit. I don't know. From my field experience of doing it with conduit, looking back on it, it would have been much better to do it with cable tray. When I look at the professional solar installations done across the country, the professional commercial solar installs are using cable tray to bring their cable back. And for anything, it's as much to make sure that the cables are kept up off the roof deck as much as possible. So I know in the Solar City circumstance, they were not doing much maintenance on the arrays. Not giving it an annual visual inspection. And so if you have a cable that's laying in a puddle and one of the actual connectors between the modules to modules is laying in that puddle, it can short out and cause a ground fault. There used to be a much larger ground fault concern, which was a runaway ground fault. And there's that was caused, there's not much information that gets published on these kinds of failures, but the kind of more notable failure, I saw one mention of a MC4 connector in a puddle of water on a rooftop as a cause for one of the Solar City Walmart fires. I don't think any of those fires burnt down the building. But there have been some other notable fires that have burned down buildings, Dietz Watson being one of them. And that major failure point was caused by the conduit on the rooftop. So we say, well, we want to manage our cable, and so maybe putting it in conduit is better. So it comes out the edge of the array and then it goes into conduit rather than being strung from one row to the next. Well, and that's okay, but are you having conduit coming out on every single row? Because sometimes these circuits have to be connected together. And so are you stringing cables, under the array until you get to an exit point and then bringing out in conduit? Cable tray is a little bit more flexible than conduit, so you can really bring all the conductors into it when you're as you go from row to row. But the problem with, I'd say, most of the notable commercial solar fires has actually been the conduit itself. So maybe this conduit idea is not the best. Conduit's made of metal, and the rooftop is hot. And so what happens, particularly if you anchor the conduit support to the roof, or you over clamp, this is supposed to be a secure but loose connection. If it's tight, what'll happen is during thermal expansion that conduit is going to push on where it's clamped down to. And even on a well-installed conduit run that was installed in a workmanlike manner, if the metal conduit is too long and it gets too hot on the rooftop, and and I see your question, William. We'll get back to it. what happens is the conduit pulls out of its fitting. And so there are expansion joints required about every 120 feet to account for thermal expansion. And it's just not a good idea to have any section of these rails one way or the other or in conduit stretching more than 120 feet in a joined fashion unless there are expansion points built into it. And so code actually kind of takes care of some of these issues within the array itself. In commercial building code, there are requirements that say every 120 feet you need at least a 4-foot, but often an 8-foot walkway between subarray sections. But a designer could easily forget about the conduit run that comes out of the array. If the array section is 120 feet long, that home run might be 250 feet. And so even if half of that home run is done in conduit on a hot roof, you can run into problems. Unfortunately for this solar design, it got discontinued by the manufacturer. And it was a little bit of a pain in the back to install. But this rooftop you can even see some standing water down here on the rooftop. There are some parts of the country where it does rain, every 3 or 4 days on a regular basis, and flat roofs will fill up with water. The concern about elevating the rack is a variation on another concern about solar, which is, will it add too much weight to the roof? Can the roof support it? And there are commercial rooftop systems out there that are already pushed to their limits. Let's say a building was not designed with a fire alarm suppression system in mind, and then the fire alarm suppression system was built into the building at a later point, and that might have added enough weight to the truss of the building that the engineer comes back and says, there's no weight. In fact, the building's already overweighted. So absolutely under no circumstance can you put any weight on that rooftop, and you don't have a project at all. There's no solution if the roof's already overburdened. But if the roof is relatively strong, the question becomes, well, how much weight does a commercial solar array add to the rooftop? And these concrete-based systems that fill in the whole ballast pan with concrete can weigh 10 pounds a square foot or more. And there's a lot of buildings who once you start talking about adding an additional 10 pounds per square foot to the rooftop, the structural engineer says, no, there's not enough headroom built into that to stay within our safety factors. But then there's other buildings that are plenty strong, and the reason why this rack was discontinued as opposed to a cheaper, just cover the roof with concrete approach is that this cover the roof with concrete approach is cheaper. This kind of racking system on a bid can come up as the material cost can be half the cost as a elevated racking structure. You still have to include the very real cost of the concrete. On this elevated racking structure, the way that we got around the dead weight issue, because on this particular warehouse, the engineer came back and said, it cannot support 10 pounds a square foot of dead weight. It needs to be less than that. The way we reduced the dead weight of the array on this array was to penetrate through a flat roof, and to a solar installer, the idea of poking a hole in a flat roof can sound real scary. Well, I have news for you. This is going to be a construction site on top of your roof. And so if the project is not prepared to patch a hole in the roof to begin with, then they can run into problems if a worker drops a tool and slashes a hole through this membrane, and then it starts to rain. Where's that water going to go? It's going to go through that hole. And so obviously the last thing a solar installer wants to do is make a bunch of Swiss cheese out of a flat rooftop. And so the idea of the concrete ballasted systems is very appealing to the solar installer to say, I don't have to worry about that. Well, you still do, turns out, because you can, moving a bunch of heavy concrete around on the rooftop wears the roof out. And so if you're trying to uh, get around poking a hole in the roof because you're concerned about the integrity of the roofing system, putting a bunch of heavy concrete on top of the rooftop is not the best of ideas either, simply because of the weight involved to carry around that much concrete on the rooftop. So what do? Well, the solution is you get rid of the concrete. And how do you get rid of the concrete? Well, you get rid of the concrete by anchoring the racking system to the roof, and that means you have to poke a hole in the rooftop. Here's our hole. It's quite small, just enough to get a U-bolt around to bolt a metal plate to the iron truss below it. And then they've kind of get these screws to kind of tamp down the TPO membrane, and then this TPO stuff actually has a heating pad that kind of gets melted onto the existing TPO, and that forms a very watertight protection. Very water. It's I think it's way more watertight than a flashed rafter penetration, because you can actually look and inspect the seal on this thing. And if you notice, our penetrations on this rack are only made at the corners of the array. So the dead weight of the array, even without concrete, 3 or 4 pounds a square foot of a large array surface, makes it act kind of like a net that is spread out throughout the rooftop. And so the wind is really not enough to pick the net off of the roof and throw it into the air. The main concern becomes how do you prevent the array from sliding around? In a gust of wind, you don't want it to budge. In high winds, you don't want it to budge. In an earthquake, you don't want it to move. So how do you keep the array from bouncing around up on the roof or blowing around on the rooftop? And it turns out, anchoring you either need to use a lot of weight. You need to use a lot of weight to overcome that friction coefficient, or you can secure it to the rafter to overcome that friction coefficient. One way requires a lot of weight, the other one doesn't. And so the point is, in your commercial designs, consider using an installer who can poke a hole in the roof and seal it in a competent manner. And that might mean you use a combination of a roofing crew and an electrical crew for the install. And consider adding anchor points to the array, even if you're using a system like this where it's the common and the cheap system where the array is sitting right on the roof deck. Even in a system like this, anchoring the corners of the ballast system to the roof, anchoring the corners of the large subarray is all you need to substantially reduce the concrete that is filled in to the ballast fans. So it's not for all cases. Maybe on smaller commercial projects like what we're talking about today, if it's just a small 20 kilowatt array, doing the fast and simple concrete based solution is the way to go. On a larger commercial project, I would look much more strongly at getting rid of the concrete and doing penetrations. William, we'll probably pick your question up right after the break. And so it'll be a little bit. Okay, there's some other commercial notes. There are ways to run a portion of the building off grid and have the rest of the building remain grid tied. So I had someone ask me, hey, I have a media company and I want to run my media storage completely off grid because I don't want to have any worries or concerns about power surges, coming up the AC line and frying out my, system. Or you just might get into like, hey, I want to put DC lighting, on the top floor of my building. Is it possible for me to, run that kind of system in my building without having an interconnected solar battery? And so the answers to that is yes. There are battery inverters that are not bidirectional, that don't outflow into the grid as well as feedback, that are one way. They often are cheaper, and even if you have an off-grid array, you can still connect an AC battery charger to it. So, there's one kind of weird configuration out there that is useful when the utility is not allowing you for some reason to directly interconnect the solar to the grid. There's still solutions out there, but it's kind of outside the scope of today's class. This is kind of an interesting one with respect to cable management. On a residential rooftop, you are typically installing, the one solar module is plugging into its next door neighbor. So positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. Or you're installing these little boxes behind every single, module, and these cables plug into the box, and then the boxes plug in positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. Either way, you get a bunch of loose cable on the rooftop, which you then have to manage. And that cable management, just like in commercial, it becomes the, kind of the line between a good installer and a bad installer is how they do their cable management. On a residential system, I kind of select which rack I use based on the integrated cable management that goes into it. Now, because the worst thing is just having loose and unmanaged cable underneath your solar array. Most solar circuits are 600 volts. That's their upper voltage limit. So they're running around 400 volts, but they're sized so that when the array is at full power on the coldest day of the year, that causes voltage to increase. Heat drags down voltage, temperature. Cold will reduce resistivity and increase voltage. And so we designed for a 600 volt limit on the roof. Commercial buildings can have 1,000 volt systems. Sometimes charge controllers, if you say, okay, I want to do my own off-grid system or something, you go and you look at some DC to DC charge controllers, DC coupling charge controllers are only sized for 150 volts, and that means you get into much smaller circuits. So if you're designing like a residential off-grid system, you can kind of get surprised by the fact that a lot of the product selection out there is for lower voltage. But yesterday we talked about a module level or a string level 1,000 volt optimizer. SolarEdge, which does module level systems, have it doesn't really matter to them because they're just intercepting products at the module level, but they'll have output capacities that are rated for 1,000-volt systems. Let's see. We're going to segue for a moment into solar financing discussion, because what we're doing is we're kind of ahead in our course material, but we're gonna keep going through it, and that'll give us the latter half of the program to look at some design examples, and have more general question Q&A. And so let's keep on moving forward. So now we're gonna move away from solar peaker batteries for a minute, and for the next hour or so. And then right before our break, we'll pause so you can type out some questions, and then right after the break, we'll pick up with those questions. A few years ago, I had it in my head to address some wrongs going on in green energy pricing in the U.S. And while I never, figured out how to solve the problem, this is some very interesting head scratching stuff. What we're talking about is voluntary green power purchasing. So you might get a letter in your mail that says, sign up for your utility green energy plan. How much is it going to cost you to sign up for your utility green energy plan? Well, as far as the actual premium, what was charged to the customer for green power pricing, the average premium applied was almost 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So I know these numbers are hard to read, but I think we have it on the next slide in a little bit greater detail. So what does this actually mean? Well, it means that for every kilowatt hour sold, the utility is agreeing to buy a kilowatt hour of green electricity. And for that service, they're charging almost 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And the question is, well, how much does that green kilowatt hour, that extra green kilowatt hour that's being voluntarily purchased, how much does it cost the utility to go and buy it? And the average cost of that premium green value to the utility is in many cases negligible. Less than 1/10 of a penny a kilowatt hour. So a lot of and some of the reason for this is there's a carbon credit market that tracks this stuff called renewable energy credits. Okay, it's not exactly the same as a carbon credit, but it's a green credit for, every time you generate 1,000 kilowatt hours of green energy, you can claim that you've generated one of these credits, and you can sell it to someone else, and that confers the legal bragging rights are sold from person A to person B to advertise the greenness. And so, that kind of imaginary system is necessary because, when the green energy from the wind farm hits the grid, you can't separate out the green electrons from the brown electrons. So the wind farm says, hey, there's voluntary buyers for my green energy. I want some extra money. How do I value the greenness of my energy absent any other, state or federal regulation? This voluntary system is established. Utilities say, we have voluntary customers who are willing to spend more money on their electric bill if the power is green, so why don't we sell it to them? And the problem with these credits is because by and large they are whatever mandates there are for these credits to be purchased, they're at the state level, they're not at the federal level, and the states they don't have an interest in making these penalties excessively large. And so what happens is the green power production by the state is often built out to exceed the requirements of these penalties. And so the end result is there's a surplus of these credits, and the credit markets are really not worth much in most states. Now there are exceptions. This can be a cudgel where utility regulators or state regulators could increase the price of these credits and make them valuable and use that to drive their policy. We're not talking about green energy mandates here. We're talking about voluntary green energy pricing. And within voluntary green energy pricing, if you look at the average price that was paid by the customer versus the average cost that was spent by the utility to purchase the renewable energy certificate or the renewable energy credit to confer the legality of this transaction, just looking at the average price difference versus the average cost difference, out of $1 of voluntary green energy premiums paid, only about 5 cents of that dollar actually made it to the green energy project itself. The rest of that money went to utility overhead expenses of administering the program, or also funding green education or other, fluff departments in the utility. And the utility's bottom line is to burn fossil fuels. So they're taking $1 from an environmental altruist and they're keeping 95 cents towards their bottom line and throwing a nickel at the green power project. That sounds like a very weak, bad, if not unethical product to me. And so it's really all over the board. I guess this slide is not that accurate of what I wanted to convey, but I kind of smushed the scale here. But these dots represent green power pricing along the x-axis. So down here, the cost to the customer is about 1/10 of a penny. And so there are power companies out there whose green premium pricing plans to the customer are 1/10 of a penny a kilowatt hour. Most of them are in the 1.5 cent a kilowatt hour range. Some of them get up into the 4 cent a kilowatt hour range. And whereas the actual cost incurred of buying these green energy credits by the utility is right down here at a 1/10 of a penny. So, green power is one of the more profitable, voluntary green power is one of the more profitable products that a utility has to offer. Why is that real important? What it is saying is, okay, maybe the utility with this renewable energy credit stuff, in some cases are going overboard. In other cases, maybe they are overspending on their green credits and not keeping the money. I don't really know the ins and outs of every program. I know the national average premium price and the national average premium cost, and there's a huge difference. But what it also says is that there are customers out there who are willing to spend more money on their electric bill if they feel like they're doing something good with it. And so the problem with these green energy plans is not that they didn't confer that feeling, but that they could be much more cost effective at putting that money to its intended use. And so what's happening today is these kinds of green power purchase plans are phasing out, and instead what's replacing it is community solar options, which are much more real and tangible than a green power plan by the utility. So in a utility community solar project, theoretically, someone should be able to say, hey, I might not actually be an owner, but I'm buying my electricity from that wind farm or solar array, and they can actually point to the wind farm or solar array and say it's that one that I'm helping support. Whereas if you buy a green power plan from a utility company, they sometimes do not even tell you where that green energy is actually coming from, because they don't want to reveal their business practices. And so here we have a community solar project. It says Geronimo sells 66 megawatts of community solar portfolio to Berkshire Hathaway. We talked about that utility scale, the impacts of the tax credit on the utility scale market yesterday. And one impact is utility scale projects. And so we see a lot of utility scale sized community solar. I talked to one of the participants in this particular community solar project, which was real interesting because neither Geronimo Energy nor Berkshire Hathaway would tell me anything about their program because I did not live in the service territory of the program. So I could not be a customer of the program. They would not tell me anything about it. And they don't publish, the exact terms and conditions on their website either. So anyway, so I went straight to the source. I talked to a customer on this program to say, why are you a community solar participant? And he says, okay, well, it's a 25-year agreement, but if you move, you can get out of it. So you're only trapped in the agreement if you stay there. And there is a termination fee depending on if the utility is going to lose money by you getting out of the contract, where they'll try and replace you on the list. Now, the way that Minnesota's program is set up is for 25 years you get a flat rate on your electricity bill. So you increase your electric bill today and it stays flat over 25 years. So presumably, 10, 15 years from now, the price of electricity goes up and it's easy to find a replacement in the program. So your ownership gets more valuable as time goes by, which would make it easier to swap out if you could. But that assumes the price of electricity is going to go up, and that's not always guaranteed. If solar was powering a 400% solar grid where we have so much solar power we don't know what to do with it, the price of electricity could be next to nothing. So, it's a little bit of a bet that the price of electricity is going to go up with time. I usually model the price of electricity to kind of stay even with inflation, not really going up, not really going down. So I say, well, how much is that rate stabilization? The fact that you're buying into something, you're spending some, in Minnesota's plan, the customer doesn't spend any money up front. They just commit to buying the electricity at an agreed upon rate. So how much is that rate stabilization a factor? And he says, I don't really care if my rate would go up or down. And I don't really care if I'm spending a little bit more money with participating in the program than otherwise. What I like about the program is that it's more local than the green energy purchasing option. And it allows me to feel like I'm owning solar and doing something, even though someone else is worrying about it and taking care of it. So it's like right here we say, okay, these community solar participants are not like investors. They're not trying to make tons of money off of the community solar program. It's more like they're interested in helping out. And if that means they increase their electric bill a little bit today with the option that it might go down in the future, they're getting enough market participation for people to go for that. And I think that that's pretty interesting because if I'm a power company and I'm looking at maybe a lot of competition today or even kind of extreme deregulation tomorrow, I might be very interested in getting my customer base to start signing, 25-year long contracts at a rate hike today, guarantee that rate hike for 25 years and guarantee, the value of the customer for 25 years. That might be a really good deal. So there's an opportunity there for utilities and customers to kind of get closer together under the presumption that they're going to be building a utility scale community solar project. The Massachusetts community solar program is a little bit different. In Massachusetts, the instant you sign up for the program, you start saving money on your electric bill. Now, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and that applies to carbon pollution, and also applies to solar programs where you start saving money for nothing. So, what's going on with that? Well, the money's coming from somewhere. So if you're calling up your power company and you're immediately getting a 5 to 10% discount off of your electric bill, what is going on with that? Well, at what they're doing is they're still committing to, a 25-year purchasing contract, but instead of increasing their electric bill by, 10 to 20% and having it be a fixed rate over a long period of time, here they're decreasing their bill by 5 to 10%, but maybe there's an escalator built into it. Now, on top of that, Massachusetts has, these green credits are called renewable energy credits. And Massachusetts has a state level mandate market that drives up the cost of these credits. So you go into a state like Texas, and Texas has a renewable energy market and a renewable energy credit market, but all the renewable energy credits are worth $1 for 1,000 kilowatt hours. And this is not the value of the kilowatt hour itself, it's the value of the green credit on top of that. So in Texas, these credits are so overabundant because the green purchase requirements are very low and the supply of green energy is very high that you get a surplus of credits and the credit prices are next to nothing. In Massachusetts, the credit prices for the same green credit can be over $300. That means you divide by 1,000, and that means the green credit in Texas is only worth a tenth of a penny a kilowatt hour, but in Massachusetts, the green credit, because of their state policy, could be worth 30 cents a kilowatt hour, which is about the price of electricity per kilowatt hour in Massachusetts. And so, what Massachusetts is saying through their policy is that, solar electricity, they're going to state mandate that it be worth twice as much as, the current pricing of regular electricity. And, yes, something like that is extreme and perhaps overkill. What they've done is they've set a very high bar for renewable adoption in Massachusetts. And so they say, if you don't like how expensive that is, then do more of it and bring the price down that way. And of course, that's politically contentious. But at any rate, the developer of the community solar program says, you know what, I have more money coming my way here in Massachusetts than I do in Minnesota. Minnesota, they don't have that green credit market. The green credits aren't worth nearly that much. So they have to do something that's, a little column A, a little column B. We're going to increase your electricity pricing today. You might save some money down the road. In Massachusetts, they have so much solar subsidy that the developer says, you know what, let me keep that retail price renewable energy credit and I'll cut you in by reducing your electric rate by 5 to 10%. And so the developer is walking away with most of the subsidy reward and value from the project. But the thing is with Massachusetts, to get permission to build the community solar project, you need members who've committed to signing on board so that they can go to the Public Service Commission and say, I have X many people interested in doing my project, and here's their names, and so let's greenlight this project, give me access to the special rate structures, and move forward that way. So, in either case, getting participants on board ahead of time is kind of the tough one. Michigan has a different community solar project, which I think is the kind of hybrid approach. What we've seen so far are two examples where you just call up your power provider, get onto the community solar rate, and either your rate goes up or it goes down, but you're not spending money out of pocket. Michigan says we're gonna sell solar blocks, and one block of solar is equal to 500 watts of solar. So it's like, almost two solar panels is one block, one subscription block. And they say, we're going to give you a couple of different ways to participate in this program. First is you could pay us $1,300 up front, and then you own that block. The next way is you could finance it. You could pay us $40 a month over 3 years for that block. You're going to do $20 a month over 7 years for that block, or $10 a month for 25 years over that block. And so we're looking at 36. So, we're looking at, just under, $1,600. I'm just kind of estimating here, but let's just say that's $1,500, or we're looking at maybe $1,650 or so, maybe $1,700, or the $10 option for 12 months over 25 years is, that's going to be closer to $3,000 or so, maybe $2,800. And so by the time you get into the long-term financing deal, you're spending more money versus paying up front. And what's the net impact of that? Well, if you go with the upfront payment option, effectively, when you're buying $1,300 of solar at 500 watts, you're spending $2.6 per watt on your solar block. And because of the impact of the federal tax credit, that's equivalent to buying, the tax credit used to be 30%, now it's 26%. But that's about equivalent to buying, $3.40 or so on solar. And that is, about the average cost of installed solar, particularly in, I'd say $3 a watt is what you can spend on an array, but arrays are usually 8 or 9 kilowatts at least, and this is just 500 watts. So, maybe $3.50 a watt ownership in a community solar array is good pricing, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good deal. I mean, if we look at our, let's bring open our calculator here. You know, if we know that 1 watt of solar in Michigan will produce about 1.3 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, and so each year, you know, a 500-watt block should produce about 650 kilowatt hours. And so if we're taking $1,289 and we're dividing it by 650 kilowatt hours, and let's call it a 20-year program, you know, they're prepaying, you know, 10 cents a kilowatt hour for their electricity over the course of 20 years, you know, all up front. You know, so if someone comes to you and you're like, "Hey, I'll stabilize your electric bill for the next 20 years. All you need to do is give me 20 years worth of electric bill payments." You know, you might not go for that deal. And that's also why, you know, solar pricing, you know, really needs to be under this amount before people start going for it. You competitively price out a well-designed solar array, you can get it under $3 a watt. Of course, commercial arrays go for much less than that. And so how the utility is kind of making their money is they're going and installing the solar array. You know, let's just say it was a really expensive utility scale project because it was their first time through the chute. You know, they don't do this as a regular course of business. So let's say they got you know, and there's some software issues and program costs for implementing community solar. So let's just say their project costs $2 a watt at scale, because it's not a residential, it's a utility scale project. But they're able to go and sell it for $3.50 a watt. And so they're not really losing too much money. You know, they're cashing out the customer at 10 cents a kilowatt hour for 20 years. You know, that may cost them money, it may not cost them money. But they're also being able to compete with the solar installer, because now the utility can go and do a project at low cost economies of scale and then mark it up and sell it directly to the customer as an energy product. And that's and voluntarily provide some sort of net metering program, even if they don't need to provide it to all their customers. And they get to set the price, and maybe it's a good deal, maybe it's not a good deal, maybe there's more room for debate on whether or not that is a good policy for society or not. But it is a way for utilities to roll up their sleeves, be a little bit proactive about doing some solar projects, and start competing with solar installers instead of just waiting for their market share to erode. You know, let's go and look at you know, the price of electricity in Michigan is about 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And so, you know, to some extent, there is a little bit of a good deal in the sense that they're buying electricity for less than that. On the other hand, you know, for it to be a deal that most customers would find acceptable, to prepay your electric bill for, you know, 20 years solid, you would need to be getting a 60 or 70% discount before that is something that most would find attractive. And to some extent, that's why, you know, Michigan says, well, we're not asking you to buy 8 or 9 kilowatts worth of solar at this amount. You know, all you need to do is buy at $500. And if you don't want to do it that way, but you still want to help, why don't you just add $10 a month to your electric bill for 25 years, and we'll sell you the electricity from the solar array, and that'll give you that feeling of ownership. You're not really going to feel the pain on your electric bill, and maybe the price of electricity skyrockets and you end up ahead in the long run for your minuscule amount of participation. Well, okay, so I go for the $10 a month option. And my solar array is producing about 50 kilowatt hours a month of production, 650 for the year, and that comes out to be 19 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, the price of electricity in Michigan is 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and so the utility has found a way to convince someone to voluntarily increase their electric bill by 28% today and lock them into a 25-year contract, down the road. And so, that's actually a really good deal for the utility. And, the reason why the customer buys it is not so much because it's a good deal for them, but they're happy to spend an extra $10 a month for the idea that they're doing some good. Just like a few years ago, they would have been happy to spend $10 a month on green energy pricing because it makes them feel like they're doing good. Solar leasing is a concept where someone else owns the solar array, whereas a different party uses the solar array and benefits from the cost savings, and maybe is not the long-term owner. There's lease to own, and then there's a true lease where you don't get to own it at the end. If I go to Enterprise Rent a Car and I drive around their car under my rental contract, at the end of the rental contract, I don't get to keep the car. And I can go to them and say, okay, well, how about I buy that car for you for $1? Because I've driven it for so much and it's effectively mine anyway. And they're like, no, you've only driven it for 3 weeks. You have to pay fair market value for that car. We're not giving you any special deal. And so there's different kinds of leasings. There's leases commercial leases where you buy the asset at the end for $1, and there's commercial leases where you buy the asset at the end for its fair market value. And they have different rules and regulations. If your lease is something where one user is using the asset over its entire useful life, and then they buy it for $1, the tax implications are that person is the owner of the asset. If the lease terms are, the tenant is not using the asset over its entire life, the tenant is not responsible for maintenance or has any real skin in the game. They're just paying you instead of paying their electric bill, but they're not the owner. They're not claiming the tax credits. They're not making the money off of it being a good investment. They're not paying for it up front. If it's a shorter lease, then the third party owner is actually the owner. So back in the day, back when I was getting into solar leasing was really popular because solar was so expensive that the idea was someone else was going to have to own it, but people could start saving money on their electric bill today. And that may or may not be true. It's up to the customer to do due diligence on solar leases, and there's certainly companies out there who are selling, you know, misrepresenting the value of the product that they're selling. But for a long time, the problem with ownership was that there was not conventional financing available to get these products developed. And so you'd have to do investor-based financing, and investors imply third parties. And so a solar lease was a good way to accomplish that. Now the trend is for customers to actually own their solar array through loans rather than commit to a lease. And so there's operating leases. And operating leases are where the tenant is not the end owner, is not the ultimate owner. So an operating lease is like what Tesla and Solar City and are putting out there, which says up to 80% of the asset life. And so if you're crafting your own operating lease for a solar array, that's something that you have to say is, well, what's the life of the project, and the lease cannot be for more than 80% of that. Now, a utility is not subject to the same regulations as an individual private lease. Utility has its own regulators, their own products that they can and cannot distribute. So they have some, in some sense, they have some regulatory flexibility where they can do a 25-year community solar agreement for a 25-year project. But third-party leases, operating leases, where a third party is claiming the tax credit and depreciation incentives and managing the asset and is the ultimate owner of the asset at the end, they have to abide by these rules. 80% of asset life. Otherwise, it's a capital lease, which means the opposite thing as an operating lease. The lease provider is the one responsible for the insurance and maintenance, which is probably something you would want if you're crafting your own community solar array, because you don't want a bunch of individuals to be able to claim a little bit of true ownership of the rooftop and demand access to your commercial facility on a moment's notice. So you don't want to give up that responsibility for insurance and maintenance. Tied to electricity pricing or tied to a fixed monthly fee. So in the past, there's been concerns about how to legally structure these agreements. If you tie the rate to a kilowatt hour rate, would you be considered a vendor of electricity and therefore maybe in violation of state laws? One way to design around that is to do kind of what is to associate the savings or the benefit with a fixed monthly fee rather than tying it directly to electricity pricing. But both can be accomplished. There are examples of solar leases that are tied towards the actual use of the asset without violating the idea of being a vendor of electricity. You're using the equipment is generating electricity, that electricity has a value, you're being compensated for use of the equipment. Effectively where these rules and regulations are coming down to is once the building becomes a net producer of electricity. So once you are producing on an annual basis more than what offsets the electric bill, more than what offsets the energy use of the building, when you are actually behaving more like a power plant selling the electricity out onto the grid, that is when you become an electricity vendor. Whereas the regulations have kind of stayed out of behind the meter electricity sales. Operating leases can be had for no money down. Capital leases need some money down. The lease provider claims the tax credit and depreciation, and at the end of the project, either there's a fair market buyout of the project or the operator removes the asset. Capital leases are more like loans. So capital leases are when you would say, you know what, as the developer, I don't have any tax liability, and I want a simple way to transfer the tax credits from the project to whoever is the owner or the end user. And if the owner or the end user is the one claiming the tax credits, then you would set them up as a capital lease. And under a capital lease, it's a little bit different. When you're transferring tax credits, the rule of thumb is when you're transferring tax credits, you're transferring ownership, you're transferring responsibility. Um, there are industries where tax credits are more transferable than that, and there are uh, innovative business models where the people who want the tax credits will ultimately get access to them that are far beyond the ability of a single project to execute. Um, it's simpler, much more simple to just think of things in terms of operating leases or capital leases, where if the tenant is wanting to claim the tax credits, you would set up a capital lease agreement for them to make payments over time, but still be able to claim the full tax credit up front. But essentially, a capital lease is a loan. Okay, so utility solar projects, they have participants, they have a regulated body, they have a solar farm out in the field, and the utility is in a really unique position because they already have the golden Rolodex of customers, and they have that trust where you trust the utility is going to be doing the right thing and administering the program. If you are trying to develop a private community solar program, you might need to have more transparency in your program than what a utility would otherwise provide. And again, that's in part because the utility already has a well-established track record of being regulated. You may not like your utility, and some, I'd say, fringe elements have their own thoughts about the utility meters not being accurate. Um, But at the same time, you trust the utility to deliver reliable and safe electric service, and with the with rare exception, the vast majority of electric customers trust their power company. So this is actually one of the good elements of blockchain. What a blockchain is, and of course it was trendier a couple years ago when Bitcoin was at a higher price, or people were more interested in uh, sending their money elsewhere. But Bitcoin is only an application of blockchain. What a blockchain effectively is a public ledger, almost like a website, except instead of one person being in charge of all the code, everybody involved is in charge of providing a little bit of computer space to support all the code. And that means when edits or changes are made within the blockchain, everyone can see it and they can figure out what's happening. So it's not to say that the owners of blockchains, in some cases, if the blockchain becomes valuable, they steal all the money from it and shut it down and run off. But there's a record of that happening. You're not. There's a paper trail behind it. So so blockchains are not like magic bullets that solve all security issues of all financial transactions, but they do provide an anonymous but public way of viewers to see accounts and to see energy that they've been credited, and to see and to see any debits or credits that have been made to that account, almost like having an online banking system where all of the information is published to a particular website. And so as long as you know the user ID, you can see everything that's going on with their account without having to worry so much about account management. And so, there is a blockchain out there for solar data logging. And so there are software and tools available to, say, log the production of a community solar array and then ascribe token values to divvy up that production between accounts and have participants be able to pull up their accounts and see how much energy has been allocated to their account in a way that mimics the trust of a utility. In a sense, it's that community monitoring makes the community members feel like they're a larger part of a system rather than just trusting some website where they log in and have a user account and it's telling them they're getting credits, but they don't really see the justification before it. So that I guess what I'm trying to say is if you are thinking about implementing a community solar program on a site, you might run into an issue of, well, how are we technically going to provide the data logging and security for this platform so that we don't have to deal with tons of customer issues about their account, and so that they actually trust us to do what we're doing. And a blockchain is a good uh, implementation of that. And so what I would say is don't limit yourself from thinking creatively about setting up your own community solar program, because the individual programs from one utility to the next vary substantially. In Minnesota's case, they were increasing the price of electricity and selling a subscription service over a long period of time. In Massachusetts case, it was like Minnesota, except the subsidies that were available made it such that they could even sweeten the deal a little bit further to the participant. Whereas Michigan's model was completely different, and that, yes, they were offering a subscription fee, which would likely increase the electric bill, but they were also providing an upfront purchase option, which would actually cash out the utility developer at the beginning of the project. And what we've also seen from community solar members is that they're not motivated financially, like an investor would be. They're not trying to get their money back in 5 or 6 years on a 20-year agreement and walk away thinking, man, I just made a great investment like I would in a stock market. In fact, the lack of financial motive exempts community solar products from SEC regulations. And so if you designed a community solar project that was actually too good of a deal for the participant, then you might start getting into the realm of securities regulations. So to some extent, the value of the community solar participant only getting their money back over the life of the program is, but not more than that, is the is a good motive. And that's what we see with community solar members. They don't want it to be a ripoff. They want to get their money back. They're not just doing it for the altruism, but they don't really care if they get their money back or end up losing a little or end up gaining a little. They're not financially motivated like a investor. Well, presumably these commercial solar peakers that can get 6 to 8 year paybacks could have 25-year community solar participation in them. And so, again, that's because you're not using the battery every single day. And so you should get a very long life out of the battery. And the solar array component should be lasting for 25 years as well. And so what happens when you take a project that might have a 6 to 8 year payback and you sell it to an investor who only wants a 20 to 25-year payback and that's it? Well, the answer is you make a lot of money off the transaction. There's a lot of profit between, selling a product at a 6 to 8 year payback and putting so much markup on it that it then only has a 25-year payback. The issue is if you can find buyers who are happy with that 25-year payback, what that means is you can cash out your short-term investor. And so long as you have the financial structure to develop the commercial solar peaker product and put it on your rooftop, the next question becomes, well, why don't you open up ownership of the commercial solar peaker to the community? Because unlike an investor, the community owner is satisfied with a worse economic payback. And so what that allows you to do is cash out your investors earlier and increase the profitability of the project. By transitioning the array from a owner investor model to a community solar model, that might be what adds enough profitability to the project to actually pay for good array maintenance and keep the installer incentivized over the life of the asset to remain involved. So how would you do that? How would you create a community solar program? And the answer is, well, you got two options to do it simply, which is one option is to develop your own leasing program. The other option might be a little bit more simple if you have business owners wanting to buy into the community solar project. So, imagine you have a good facility for the project. You might get some business sponsorship so that they can milk some of the PR value out of it. I think creating a leasing program is ideal because you could have one of two options. You could have a leasing program where the participant pays money to the sponsor in one big lump sum up front, and then the sponsor makes recurring payments to the customer over a long period of time. Or the opposite way is that the sponsor, pays for the money up front, and then the tenant is a user who makes a series of payments in return. And so what I would say is, a nice structure for a community solar project is to build the project and then use operating leases to sell individual blocks of ownership to participants, and then over time, make them series of payments based on the cost savings of the project, and that can ultimately that can result in better financing, long-term financing at lower interest rates than what you could get from a capital equipment loan. And so I suppose what I'm trying to really say is if you can get your payback of a commercial solar peaker down to the point where it qualifies for a 7 to 8 year capital equipment loan, you could boost the value even further by, after executing that agreement, paying the loan, building the project, making loan payments. You could cash out of that loan faster by converting the project into community solar and letting some others in on the deal while increasing your profit. And again, the only reason you can do that with commercial solar peakers is because they can generate that under 10-year payback, unlike utility scale solar projects or residential solar projects in those areas. So you can cut more people in and who are satisfied with long paybacks. But if you're already taking something that has a 15-year payback and you're trying to convert it into a community solar project, all you're going to end up doing is adding more cost to it. And so kind of the short of it is commercial rooftop solar projects are the smallest market segment in the industry, but because of batteries, they have the best payback. When you look at the paybacks, so long as your demand charge starts to get over, $10 a kilowatt hour. Once you start getting into above $10 a kilowatt hour, the payback rates start to be within the realm of capital equipment financing. And these payback rates are much shorter than, customers participating in 25-year community solar agreements that want to get their money back within 25 years. So, the next step is to say, okay, well, there is some opportunity here where we can do a commercial solar peaker. And even though it might cost a lot of money, not only do we have the ability to finance it and reduce our electric bill in the short term, if we wanted to make even more money off of it, we could actually execute our own community solar project to offload the investment. And so we have a audience comment. Because in Anchorage, Alaska, we have demand charges of $44 a kilowatt. That's pretty high. So you definitely can benefit from some batteries. Just put them inside. Um, as far as payback rates go, this was a graphic that kind of got me into the solar market. It came from a study that was done in 2008, way back in the day, called Rooftop Photovoltaic Market Penetration Scenarios. And they were looking at where the rooftop solar market was going in this study. And they came up with this figure that really has less to do with solar projects and more has to do with energy efficiency upgrades in general. They're looking at the residential retrofit market, which is in black, and then this new construction market, which is in dotted lines. Let's say, which paybacks, what do you need in terms of payback to really get traction in the energy efficiency market? And this says, okay, well, anyone who's interested in making energy efficiency upgrades to their building, if they can get their money back in, immediately, most of them will do it. Some of them will still talk about light bulb quality, but, most will go after the cost savings. So this says if I get a 1 year payback, maybe 75% of the people thinking about doing the project will do it. At year 1, 2, 3, 4, and year 5, by the time you get down to your 5th year, you'll have 25%, a quarter of facility managers will say, okay, let's do it. But it might not even qualify to get into the residential new construction. And then once you get back to a 10-year payback or greater, just a very small portion of the population is going to go for it. And in fact, I was actually kind of surprised. It's almost 2% of voluntary green electricity purchasing in the United States is voluntary green energy purchasing. That was much higher than what I would thought it would be, but it's kind of consistent with this graphic. If they're not getting any payback at all or a very, long-term payback, maybe 2% of a given community is going to go in for a community solar project that has a 20-year payback to them. And this is why I like commercial solar peakers so much is, the rest of the solar market, particularly without subsidies, is looking at paybacks that might, electricity cost varies wildly. In Anchorage, Alaska, where you get very little solar production, almost none in the winter, and it's really a summertime market. The electricity price in Anchorage, Alaska might say, okay, well, that's okay. Just using solar in the summertime is acceptable. So you could have areas of the country that have low electricity pricing and a lot of sunlight. You can have areas that have very little sunlight but very high electricity pricing. So you can have markets where you get less sunlight but solar is more cost effective. But for most of the country, when you look at net metering policies being watered down or scaled back or having fees added to them, when you look at the tax credit declining, when you look at import tariff costs, offsetting the cost reductions that the industry has made over the past few years, you're looking at solar projects in the 12 to 20 year payback range, and that's not enough to get people excited. So what I like about the commercial solar peaker range is you can find paybacks in the 5 to 8 year range and get a much higher penetration into your market. I mean, solar right now it's growing, but it's only about 3% of the electric grid. So we're saying how do we get it up to where 20 or 30% of businesses have commercial solar peakers on their rooftop. What I'm saying is, that market is here right now. And so we're going to see tremendous growth in commercial rooftop solar, mostly driven by batteries, mostly going after demand charges. Okay, so we are at an hour and a half at the hour and a half market. When we come back, we're gonna look at some models in a little greater detail. Now would be a good time to think long and hard about any questions, solar peak related or solar otherwise, to type into the chat window. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some modeling and design examples. We're going to give everyone about a minute to get back here. We'll start back up in about a minute. Okay, welcome back. Now's a good time to type in questions. Uh, so William has a couple of questions. One about can you address thermal runway, address battery off gassing during a fire, and then can you address battery solar end of life disposal or recycling? These are all really good questions that the solar industry probably needs to address a little bit better as well, William. Um, so the thermal one way question, I think, really has to do with um, what happens if your battery catches on fire. There's a when your lithium ion batteries get too hot, they can catch themselves on fire, and that getting too hot could be caused by puncturing the battery, getting too slapdash with a forklift, or a particularly spectacular electric vehicle wreck. Your battery rooms have to be vented, and they have to have airflow controls, even with sealed lithium-ion batteries. The general rule is when you go above 60 volts, you start to trigger more um, rules for National Electric Code. So there's a whole article of National Electric Code governing energy storage systems that is applicable once your battery bank gets over 600 volts. The big difference between the NEC and the IFC is that the IFC requires continuous venting, whereas the NEC is more just looking to make sure the room has a venting source that can be activated to clear the volume of the room out, or the volume of the container. So, where National Electric Code is looking at it's looking at a couple of different aspects. One is the ability to ventilate the room and not having other explosive materials like gas lines in that room. The second is mechanical protection, and the mechanical protection requirements increase when you get into higher voltage systems. Things like the means of egress out of the room, which way the door opens, is all governed by code. Um, and then the third one is that the battery systems, when they get over 60 volts, need to be listed, because it's really the preventative monitoring of the battery systems to get them to shut down or shut off when their temperature starts approaching, a critical design temp, is the best way to prevent the fire rather than to wait for it to start. You bring up a good point about fire safety, though. We were talking earlier in class about different kinds of lithium technology, and we mentioned that there's lithium iron phosphate that has twice as many cycles and about twice the price as entry level lithium. And then we saw a faster battery, the lithium NMC battery, uh, that had about the same number of cycles as entry level lithium, but at a rated for a much more rapid discharge rate. And the longer lasting, slower battery, the lithium iron phosphate battery, produces much less gas when it's burning up, much less toxic gas when it's burning up than its counterparts. And so, that would be another issue of, maybe with your lithium NMC batteries, locating them at the side of the building in a temperature regulated container is optimal for slower batteries, like the Tesla Powerwall and the LG Chem battery. The solar install guides say, well, you can put the batteries outside provided that they're shaded. I would still strongly prefer the battery to be located inside. In a garage is a natural spot just to get it out of the sun, but in an air conditioned environment that has an air handling system built into it is really the best case scenario. You don't want the temperature of the outside and the temperature of the inside of the battery to be substantially different. So particularly in extreme cold environments, where the outside temperature of the battery is cold and the inside of the battery is hot, that can also stimulate the batteries getting into a internal temperature differential that causes the battery to burn up. But mainly that's solved by listed products, and that's basically saying it's great to air condition the batteries, but you have, on these lithium ion batteries, you'll get into additional firewall ratings. In Australia, they require like a concrete board to be installed behind the batteries in order to prevent penetrations from the other side. It's quite common to put a cage around the battery, if not a sealed box. We're going to look at a modeling software called Energy Toolbase. And I use Energy Toolbase because it's just simply it's faster than building my own Excel model. They make really good cash flow analysis sheets that are clear enough to make a CFO smile. I find that the number one kind of economic flaw that solar installers make when modeling commercial savings is that there are upfront depreciation advantages. So in addition to a large upfront federal tax credit, there's a 5.5 year depreciation schedule on this equipment. Sometimes you can depreciate it even faster than that. And so the issue is, installers will say, okay, well, we're lowering your electric bill, and then you get all these tax advantages as well. What they forget to kind of understand is that when you're saving money on your electric bill, you end up making more profit as a company, and you're going to end up paying taxes on that increased profit. And so there's a tax effect of the cost savings. And the problem is the installers will often model the depreciation, but not the tax effect. And the mistake is you need to either do a pre-tax flow payback analysis, You know, the tax credit is an exceptional thing. You can factor in the tax credit to the pre-cash flow tax analysis. You're not paying additional taxes on the tax credit. But if you're going to do a full proper cash flow analysis and model the depreciation, you've pulled yourself into a post-tax cash flow analysis. And so you need to model not just the depreciation, but also the additional profit, the tax on the additional profit, which is generally going to be slightly more advantageous for the user than a pre-tax flow analysis. You know, depreciation is not a huge tax incentive. You know, sometimes the renewable guys will say the oil and gas industry gets so much subsidy, but they're counting depreciation into that, and depreciation is kind of a natural incentive. It's not artificial. It's reflecting the loss associated with the decline of the asset value. The only thing that is advantageous about depreciation is instead of it being over the life of the asset 25 years, it can be claimed on an accelerated basis. And that's where the very slight incentive is. But the depreciation advantage of solar is not that it can be depreciated, it's that it can be accelerated depreciated, and it's only a modest advantage. But Energy Toolbase will take into account things like discount factors and calculate, you know, internal rate of returns, net present value, you know, simple payback, and it'll take into account your federal tax rate, your state tax rate. You know, it's useful to know how to do simple payback calculations just off the top of your head. And so, you know, with solar, that's pretty easy. You know, if you know your effective generation rate of the array and you know how much energy you're going to produce, you know, you just take the installation price, back out the tax credit, and then divide by, you know, the effective generation rate of the array and divide by, you know, how much production it's going to produce. That you can get from PV watts. This one is a little bit more complicated unless you have net metering. And so, you know, if a solar array costs $260 a watt and I'm getting 11 cents a kilowatt hour out of it, and I claim the 30% tax credit, which is a little bit less now, and my solar array is producing 1.4 kilowatt hours per watt per year, you know, if I have a 260 a watt array, which is about as cheap as it gets for residential solar under competitive pricing using, you know, mid-tier quality. Um, After the tax credit, that's $1.80 to a watt. You know, I like multiplying how much energy the array produces per watt per year by how much that energy is worth to get me a dollar per watt per year payback metric. So it's like, okay, if I have an array that costs $1.80 to a watt and I'm generating 16 cents per watt per year, you know, that's going to give me a 12-year payback. Um, See, I'm not entirely sure where I was going with that. If I had a lower install rate, I'd have a quicker payback. Mhm. But the right sizing of a solar peaker has to be economic based because you're trying to optimize the peak value, and the only way to define peak energy is to say, okay, well, peak is going to be a function of your electric rate, and it's also going to be a function of your electric load, and it's more of a function of electric load, but the only way to solve that is to put a dollar and cent value on it. And so we can't do just like a simple net metering calculation. We have to use, you know, software to assist this design process. And so we have to do kind of economic modeling in order to figure out the right size of the system. And so what we see here in Energy Toolbase is what they're suggesting is that the larger the array gets, so this is 29 kilowatts of battery output capacity, 57 kilowatts, 86 kilowatts. The larger the system gets, it's generating at in this case $200 a kilowatt hour, $200 a kilowatt hour. That's of the battery size. Where what we're saying is all of a sudden you get too large with your peaker plant and you get into diminishing returns. That's just like what we were talking about yesterday. In this particular design, with solar, we can take the load that was here and then now bring it down to our new load here. Or we can, with solar on a partly cloudy day, still slightly reduce the load, but our peak savings is only going to be that much. And even if we went and added a solar battery to this, if we did a battery that could load level, this much, shave off all these spikes, that would be more cost effective than trying to load level, a larger portion of the day. So you do get into diminishing returns, and either you're going to hone in on that by guess and check, or you're going to use some software to optimize the configuration for you. Even when using this software, it's good to check multiple extremes. Large solar, small solar, no solar, large battery, small battery. There's another economic modeler that's free called PV Value. And then there's one called SAM. SAM is pretty powerful and it's pretty technical. PV Value is a little bit more wimpy, and is just better at doing kind of like cash flow models like this. So we're going to do an example in a minute. The last of our kind of theory discussion is to say, okay, well, now we have a demand rate charge. So I have my peak demand here, and maybe a solar peaker plant can be particularly well suited for half of the difference between our peak demand and our base load demand. A solar peaker might be able to be sized for half of that, or a more cost effective one might only be sized for a quarter of that. And depending on which option we do is going to be kind of dependent on the budget and how fast of a payback you want. So the next kind of missing piece of this puzzle.
Hey, JR, are you still there? Just to the attendees and to JR, I cannot hear JR speaking, so if someone else can't hear him, it would be nice to hear maybe a confirmation from someone else.
Okay, now I'm changing things up a little bit. I don't know. The microphone's going on my end.
Yeah, I can hear you now. It sounds like you're coming back in, and
Um. Okay.
everyone else can hear you too, so
Okay. All right.
it's just a
Well,
temporary
so
cutout or something.
interesting. Okay. Well, good catch. Um. all I wanted to make on this point is that you have, if your new demand has gone from here to here, there is additional opportunity in this empty space, because what this empty space, this difference between your new peak load and then your current base load, this energy represents the cheapest electricity in the United States, where if you have a high peak load and a low energy rate, this electricity in the most extreme cases can get down to, about a penny a kilowatt hour, sometimes a bit more, but often it's 4 cents a kilowatt hour or less. It's right down there at the avoided cost rate of electricity, because the thing is, during those times, the grid actually has the capability to, supply that electricity to you for the most part, and it's being burned up and wasted. And so under a, so the point is, you could have more electrical consumption on site without increasing your electric bill if you can figure out how to use it during off-peak times rather than peak times. And that can be accomplished through thermal mass storage. Like if you had a bunch of refrigerators and freezers, double them and fill them halfway up with, blocks of jugs of water. Add some thermal mass to it. Now that may or may not be practical. Real estate costs get in the way. Bitcoin mining is a way of converting electricity into money. And it only works profitably when you have cheap electricity. And so there's tremendous, environmental concern about Bitcoin mining, because it can be done in countries that heavily subsidize their electricity costs. You could have, you know, I, I don't want to say that it's the lower income users who are mining Bitcoin for money, but you could certainly have someone in a circumstance where electricity is being handed out for free and it's very dirty electricity, using that for Bitcoin mining and making some money off of it. But at the end of the day, someone's paying the piper for that cheap electricity. But if you're a facility energy manager, you could say, okay, well, I have access to all this cheap electricity and I'm already doing an energy overhaul. If you're really thinking futuristically, you could consider turning your facility into a Bitcoin miner during off-peak times, and generating some income that way, while providing some demand management. And this is what I think is so funny about that, is it sounds like it can be a real pie in the sky idea. That sounds ridiculous, but I was able to find an article of a blockchain company looking to develop a cryptocurrency facility in Murfreesboro, Illinois. It's like, well, now, I really don't know, or don't really care what a cryptocurrency facility does, other than, you can use it to turn electricity into money for better or worse. And lo and behold, Murfreesboro is located like pretty much right here. So Murfreesboro is located in an area where there are sky high New York City peak demand prices and dirt cheap electricity prices. And so that is, why you can find these opportunities where, people might have a need to run electricity that only needs to be run off peak. Just remember that this electricity here is pennies a kilowatt hour. It's the cheapest electricity in the country. So that can be an actual opportunity for energy managers. Maybe you're running, there's some landscape features that you can run and incorporate that only use the electricity during that time. I don't know. So what we're going to do is do an energy toolbase model and try and hone in on a optimal design. So we're going to do this from scratch. I'm not going to try and give you too much software training, but this is a process that is pretty standardized, whether or not you're doing it, whether or not you're doing it within a commercial software or not. This is how interval data commonly comes from a power supplier. And so I've gotten this interval data for this facility for the entire month of, for the entire year of 2016. And so I see this facility has a 4 kilowatt draw at midnight on January 1st. And then I see that by 6 a.m. on January 1st, the power has risen to 90 kilowatts. And so the one thing that can be a little odd about these graphs is like leap year or daylight savings time can if you can mess with your model. So if you're building it by hand, you have to go through and check if you're adjusting it right for 15-minute versus 30-minute versus an hour-long periods. We saw earlier that PV Watts' data comes in hour-long periods, so you might have to chop that up into 15-minute periods. But here in the commercial software, they're making it as easy for us as possible. And so we're going back and saying, okay, January 2016 is our start date. And so now we have our data. We're going to paste it in. Well, this is quite a bit of data. 15 minutes for every hour of the day for every day of the year. So we'll select import data. And now it says we need to select a utility. And here are my preloaded electric rate structures. I'm going to use 4-county just for expediency. You have to go and set up the software to tell it which rate structures you want to use. Okay, so 4-county isn't that great. Let's see if Entergy might get better results. Okay, so here we have Entergy Mississippi rate, and we'll just call this dental office. And we're going to model it under a general service electric rate. And what we can see is there's, this general service electric rate is just for an energy bill. And so if they're on, we can go and look at the rate structure details. And we can say, okay, is it a time of use rate? Are there fixed charges? We can customize this rate, but for the most part, Energy Toolbase as a company is hard coding this stuff into their software, which is a pretty large effort. And so they're giving us a tiered energy rate where tier 1 is the first 870 kilowatt hours, and they cost 14 cents, 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Tier 2 is the next 7,870 kilowatt hours, and tier 3 is the next 60,000. And I guess the assumption is if you start getting out past those tiers, all of a sudden you're not going to be in the general rate service. You're going to be in the large general rate service. And so under this large general rate service, now under the energy charges, instead of it being 14 or 15 cents a kilowatt hour, now the tier 1 is 6 cents and the tier 2 is 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So we have our energy charge is much less. And then we get into our demand charge, and they're giving us a tier 1 and a tier 2 demand, maybe a off-peak demand and a peak demand, and they're charging $5 or $6 demand charge for that. And that's where, I guess it's showing up as this tier 2 other demand charge, because that's what is substantially increasing their electric bill here. I go and do let's see. This is the problem with being in Mississippi, is you don't get as much attention from the others. So here's a Dixie Electric company, and they have here we have an energy charge of 8 to 7 cents, and a tiered demand charge of about $10. And then we have a different industrial rate, where the demand charge is a little bit higher. And I don't know about the energy rate. Probably should have done this example outside of Mississippi. But regardless, we're here. And so we're going to pick we're just going to roll with it. We're going to pick this rate detail. And then we have this button that says show seasonal load profiles. And so we can see from our demand data, we can see our winter, spring. Winter is a spiky peak with our peak load. That's probably an electrical heating load. Spring is a overall lower demand profile, although we still have some heating loads that must be turning on in March. Weekdays we got off peak. Summertime, weekends, nothing. All of this is electrical load from computers and devices and appliances, as well as air conditioning loads. That's kind of fun. We can start kind of looking around and learning a little bit more about our facility usage. So we've picked out our rate structure. We want to throttle 100% of our battery. We don't want to have any reserve capacity. Now, we've talked enough about economics, and that's really outside the purview of this class. So all I'm trying to show here is, here's different federal tax incentives that we're modeling. Next, we get to our solar array, and so this is assuming we've already know our array size, and solar on commercial buildings can actually be easier to size than on residential, because often on flat open commercial roofs you don't have to worry about trees, and so you can otherwise make assumptions about heights of things and overassume. And that air conditioning unit is 5 feet tall, so what we can use trigonometry to determine shadow lengths of 5 foot tall objects or 3 foot tall parapet walls. And generally speaking, if you're staying 4 feet away from air conditioning equipment, and you're removing modules that are on little small subarray sections and only keeping nice, large, easy to install subarrays, you're not going to run into shading issues on commercial rooftops. And so for that reason, we can just go and enter, our PV watts data based on local weather data and just enter in our array size. And it helps to know some pricing here, but just for grins, let's assume a 20 kilowatt solar array, and let's assume it was installed as part of this project for $2 a watt. That's a $40,000 solar array. And we're going to give it a 15-degree tilt angle and 180-degree south orientation. And so all of this stuff is just sending that data directly to PV watts. And, we'll click save. So we're kind of guessing that size. There are optimization tools put into it. Let's say, that kind of give us some insight on our effective kilowatt hour rate. That's saying, look, you're hovering, your effective value for this array is around 8.5 cents a kilowatt hour, although it does slightly decrease the larger the array goes. There are some demand savings that can be had from your solar array, but it diminishes the larger the array gets. So we got energy savings, we got demand savings, and because this particular electric rate structure is kind of split between half between demand and half between energy, we actually get a pretty scalable solar array on this side. And so for the next part, we go into our energy storage system, and it says there's no energy storage left. Already we are able to visualize our demand load profile. And so this is what you can do in a spreadsheet, but it's much easier to do with a little bit of programming expertise helping out. What we're looking at is what was our max rate before and our max rate after. And so what we're seeing here, we can kind of inspect the whole month, or just inspect the time range. So what we want to do is look at, so here's our next day of max demand, and our solar array is really not impacting our production all that much. Let's just move on into the battery size part. We're going to add our energy storage system. We're just I guess so some of these battery companies are already going directly into the system. So I had an emailed question from a student yesterday about battery software. I haven't seen the STEM one before, but that looks like it's not brand specific. So that might be some battery management software. So now we're inputting in our storage details. And we have a couple of things to think about. One is what's the total energy capacity of the battery system. And so why don't we just start by using like a $10,000 Tesla Powerwall 2 as an example. And let's do 10 of them. Keep the math easy. So those are 13.5 kilowatt hour batteries. And so 10 of them is 135 kilowatt hours. And then the max discharge capacity, they're 5 kilowatts each. So we're going to do 50 kilowatts as the max discharge capacity. And let's just do their charge capacity is the same as their discharge capacity. And let's assume that we're going to go for a little bit longer life out of the system. And so we're only going to discharge them down to 80%. Well, I don't know. That's something that you could play around with to determine what is best. All the other rates, I would just keep at their standard rates. Energy Toolbase is really written with lithium-ion batteries in mind, and yeah, and then we got some additional rules here. We have charging restrictions. So let me try and get this to zoom in a little better. Because it's not liking when I zoom in as a. Because it's not liking when I zoom in. But we have some additional charge control settings, and I've actually learned this as a little bit of a learning tool to see how there's different modes of operation that you could use a battery in. You could use energy arbitrage, where you're charging the battery at an off-peak time and then discharging it at a peak time. And you could say, actually, no, I don't want you to do that because I only want you to use for peak demand shaving. That's based on your rates. You have to have about a 20 cent a kilowatt hour rate differential for energy arbitrage to really make sense. Although you still could use it after you've bought the battery to lower your electric bill if that's the end goal. It's so that's a little bit dicier. The peak demand is where the real cost effectiveness is coming from. And then it says, do we want to charge it from solar only or charge it with no charging restrictions? We're going to start out with solar only and factor in the value of the tax credit. And we're going to turn off energy arbitrage. We're going to look at its optimizer configuration and kind of get some insight into what system sizes we should be looking at. And so what we're seeing here is that mainly we're focusing on the demand savings. They're looking at energy savings, and they're also looking at demand savings, and then we get this blended number. And what we see is now the larger the system goes, the less incremental savings we're gaining for increase in system size. And so there really is a sweet spot's going to be kind of along this projection, when we're at a steeper uptick than below. But what it also says is the smallest one might be the most valuable one as well. And so that's good if you only have a limited project. If you don't have $135,000 to do 10 Tesla Powerwalls, if you only have $20,000 and maybe that only gets you one, it still might be that the starting point is the most cost-effective point. And so what we're looking here is really, a system rating of 5 kilowatts or 15 kilowatts or 26 kilowatts is going to be more cost-effective. And we started out in this 40 to 50 range. So we might find that downsizing the system gives us a quicker payback. When I'm looking at these systems, uh, I'm looking at this data that's being calculated alongside the design work, where we have the total system capacity, the maximum discharge value, the annual cycles of full batteries. Look, I'm only cycling those batteries 45 times fully per year, so I'm not really using them that much. And then I have this blended savings of $14 per kilowatt hour. So that's really good. I'm charging my batteries at 8 cents a kilowatt hour, and when I'm discharging them, I'm saving $14 a kilowatt hour. So that lends itself to a decent payback. And so we're going to go fine tune this and show how to kind of use this economic based data to figure out the optimal size. Transactions, we're just going to model a cash purchase and not, why don't we just put in, let's say $500 and $500, although it's probably more than that. Well, so we're budgeting in $1,000 a year in an added cost for this project, just because we need to plug in something. And so it's telling us that this payback is at 16 years. It's at a negative value for the first 10 years. It's a long-term project. And so I'm saying, okay, well, my batteries only come with a 10-year warranty, except I am using my batteries so lightly that they're probably going to last 25 years because I'm only fully cycling them 45 times. So, my battery's a little bit too large. Maybe my solar array isn't that isn't completely needed either. So finally, you get a report, and the only reason why I'm pulling up this report is there's some additional useful design information in this report related to those 45 cycles. So this tells you all the funny, fun, project information. We haven't optimized the system yet, so we're not full. It's this graphic right here that I wanted to show you on the right. This energy storage annual utilization rate. It says even when we're using the battery, and we're using the battery, for 200 days a year, we're using the battery 0 to 20%. And only on a couple of days a year do we use the battery 80 to 100%. So for the most part, this battery is just sitting there not being well utilized. That would be a good size for a backup battery, but it's not. It's too large for a battery. A battery that is going to be really aimed at peak management should be used pretty completely when it's being used. You don't want to oversize too much, otherwise it'll be less cost effective. So what we're going to do is two things. First, we're going to look at our demand profile now that we've added the battery. And the reason why we want to do that is it's just helpful to put kind of a story on what your electric load looks like. And so, here I'm looking at my new load profile. And why don't we just, I want to examine the worst day in January from before the system was put into place. And so here's our worst day. And what does this tell us based on what we know? Is this going to be a good size or not? Well, we have in red, this red line, we have the battery state of charge. And I don't really know how it scales on this scale. Maybe the scale's over here at 100% and 0 would be fully discharged. But we kind of look at how it is compared to its neighbors. And so, now it's going down to a full state of discharge at this point. And so the worst case scenario before, we had our peak demand in the morning, and now the battery is turning on and it's discharging that peak demand, and it's not really getting fully discharged. And then the solar array comes back up again, and we see that the battery is being fully recharged with solar. And so that's good. That's where we want to be. Maybe all we've learned is that the battery array is the solar array is fully recharging the battery, so maybe the solar array is slightly oversized. And then we've also learned that the battery is large enough to approach this early on day in the month and level its demand. And to me, it looks like it's kind of spot on because, we've been able to take out the first big peak and maybe the second peak. And really, if I was looking at the next size down, I'd be looking at something that would be like this, which might be ranging from a 95, 90 kW down to 75. So we might be looking at our next size down might be a 20 kilowatt battery bank to go from 60 to here, maybe 25, something half this size. So we've already gathered some good, useful information through visual inspection. And so I think you can also confirm that the battery is doing what it should be doing. So now we want to go and look at what happened on the day where the battery state of charge got down real low. Because we don't want our battery running out if it's needed. We're kind of further on into the month here. So what's happening on that day? Well, it's the previous day didn't have very good sun. And so the battery is already approaching its state of discharge so that when it turns on when it's needed, then the battery fully drains. And luckily, right when the battery got to the point where it's fully draining, the sun is starting to come up. So we ran out of juice kind of just in the nick of time. And so that might tell me, well, maybe, is it really an issue of the solar array being too small? And it's like, well, maybe if we doubled the size of the array, we would have been able to increase the array size a little bit to get a little bit more charge out of it. If that starts to occur more than a few times throughout the year, then I'd say, okay, well, maybe we are hitting kind of the bottom of the array size if we're going to have a solar array there. And so now we have the day where we have our maximum kind of bill after the project. So why is it being pushed further on into the month? Well, previously we've incurred a demand charge of this amount, and so now the battery says, okay, I'm only going to try and level the demand if we get above that amount. Otherwise, I might turn on a little bit to play some preventative games, but I'm not really going to run, at other times when the demand isn't getting up to that point. Well, so what's gone on is we've had a day of low production and the battery hasn't fully recharged. And then we have another day where we had to use the battery bit and the battery hasn't fully recharged. Well, then we have a day of not the best solar production, but the battery has been able to recover somewhat, but not quite as much as it was. Its full charge is right up here, kind of between the 80 and the 100, and this is still down. At a here we go. The red line is showing that at a 80%. And so going into the day of the worst build, because of the solar production being poor and the battery use being required, we're getting into the battery's only going into the worst day at a 43% state of charge. And so what we can literally see in this data confirms what we literally see in this data confirms that the battery is being programmed to do kind of exactly what we tell it to do, because previously, from the previous month of use, it's trying to maintain this position of this lower demand level, but it finally kind of runs out of ability to do that, and the demand pops up. And so whether or not this load came on too fast or it was reserving some capacity, that is where we say, okay, well, is it possible for us to make this day, to lower the demand for that day? Let me get out of here. And so you can go in and start looking at extreme months. Let's look at a summertime month. And so what we have, here's that one day we were kind of looking at yesterday in class, where just one day they have kind of this anomalous event, and we can see that the batteries being used during that time. And what's happening is it's being limited, it's being throttled by its discharge capability. So let's get back into changing some variables around, and at the end of the day, based on our energy transactions, we're seeing that our array has a 16-year payback. So the first thing we want to do is get rid of the solar array. We then want to go in and make sure that, because we've got rid of the solar array, that we can still apply, depreciation, but we're not going to apply the energy tax credit. And then we go back and look at our payback period, and it's off the chart. And so, we knew that this energy rate being kind of split between, half demand and half energy rates, it's not going to be an extreme one or extreme the other. So what we're going to do is we're going to put that solar array back, because it obviously helped. And instead, we're going to do an array that's twice as large. We're going to do 40 kilowatts, and at $2 a watt, we'll say it's $80,000 project. Small tilt angle, small azimuth angle. And then we'll just hop back over to our. It's already got my PV watts data. Hop back over to our transactions page, and we see the payback is 17 years instead of 15.6. So, what we've seen is that even though we've doubled the size of the array at cost, we haven't increased the profitability of the project. So that 20 kilowatt solar array was pretty good. If we did something smaller, like a 10 kilowatt solar array, setting a 20 kilowatt for $20,000 or for $40,000, we might do a 10 kilowatt for 30,000. Start getting into smaller project sizes at higher dollars per watt. And here we're looking at, do I save it? That higher project cost, that $3 a watt solar installation price instead of the $2 a watt solar installation price was enough to kick the payback off of the project. And so what we need for our project is, to have a payback that is, within reason, is something that's going to be like a 20 kilowatt array installed at $2 a watt. Something smaller than that would have too high of an installation per watt price to be economically justifiable. Something that's larger than this would have to have even lower installation price. So now we're going to work on our batteries for a minute. The first thing we're going to do is say, okay, maybe 10 Tesla Powerwalls was too much. What would it be like if we just started with 2 Tesla Powerwalls? That'd be a 10 kilowatt. That would have 27 kilowatt hour capacity. And charging only from solar. Well, our solar array is pretty large, so we don't need to, we'll have plenty of power from that. And so what this is doing is and that's saying the demand savings aren't enough to be substantial. So no, we didn't put in the updated cost here. So the energy storage system of 2 Tesla Powerwalls, let's call that solar array is a little on the cheap side. Let's just say that this is 25,000 for 2 Tesla Powerwalls. Now our payback period is down to 8 years. So on this rate structure, which is, we can go and look at, bill offsets and payments. Sometimes you get a little bit more data here. Yeah, so sometimes it's there. I know I'm clicking around on a lot of different menus, but there's different menus have different amounts of information. What we're seeing here is that our under this particular rate structure with this particular utility, the bill is kind of more energy heavy than demand heavy, and so our demand charge reduction has to be the spikiest of peaks and not even more than that because we have a relatively low demand charge. At the same time, the energy charge is on the high side, and so the solar array has a larger role to play. And so now we have a more cost-effective array because we've scaled back the solar and we've scaled back the batteries, and we've got our payback down to about a 8-year project. And so lastly, we want to make sure we're not leaving any money on the table. Why don't we do 4 Tesla Powerwalls, which will have a 20 kW output capacity and a 54 kilowatt hour project budget, and we'll just simply double the cost. Sometimes larger projects can have some added costs. The switch gears get more complicated the more components you have. And so what we're looking at here is a 10-year payback. So no, in fact, increasing the project size did not, benefit the project. And so now we're going back and we're looking at 2 Tesla Powerwalls at 10 kW under a $25,000 project budget with a total energy capacity of actually 27 kilowatt hours. And we're looking at about a 20 kilowatt array. So the next question is, well, what if we didn't use a Tesla Powerwall technology? What if we kind of broke out the battery from the inverter manufacturer, kind of like what Delta is doing, and use lithium NMC batteries and use inverter that is more of a one-to-one output rather, being accommodative of a half an hour discharge rate rather than a 2.5 hour discharge rate. And so in this kind of equivalent example, we would be assuming that, for the same amount of storage, we would be wanting, a 30 kilowatt inverter, and that it might actually be surging up to 50 kW. For that time frame. Well, so what we're basically buying is an inverter that can surge up to 50 kilowatts. That might be reflective of about 30 kilowatts of inverter output capacity, whereas the previous one was 10. And so we're buying 15 kW more of inverter output capacity, and you got to know your industry costs for this, but that's going to add, about $8,000 or $9,000 to the project. So just for the inverter additional capacity, you're looking at added system costs. And then the batteries themselves are going to cost more than the value of what you're getting out of the Tesla Powerwall. And so the battery component of the Tesla Powerwall is about $150 to $200 a kilowatt hour. While you might get some competitive savings by busting up the supply chain, the more importantly, the battery technology you're buying is way more expensive than $200 a kilowatt hour. let's call it $600 a kilowatt hour, just to assume we're tripling the price. More like we're quadrupling the price, but we're saving some money on the hardware side of things, because we're buying more hardware and we're breaking up the supply chain. But so if you're paying at least $400 a kilowatt hour more on this battery bank than to buy the nicer higher end batteries, you're looking at 27 kilowatt hours worth, $400 a kilowatt hour. You're looking at another $11,000 increase to buy the battery technology. So, to instead of looking at spending more money on additional Tesla power walls to get the power output capacity there, we're really talking about almost the choice between a Tesla Powerwall system that's twice as large, or a lithium NMC system that is smaller but with faster batteries, and ultimately more output capacity, but less storage capacity for the same cost. And so that's the question, really. Is it better to use the more expensive, faster battery and build a custom solution, or is it better to spend that money on a larger system out of Tesla Powerwalls that is more sluggish, but because it's a larger system, it comes with its own advantages and it's better than lead acid? So anyway, let's go and examine that. We've made the budget update. you know and what we see is a payback that indeed is ever so slightly improved. To me, I'm looking at, SWAT. If I'm looking at a 27 kilowatt hours of and so let's look at it. This is using the higher end technology and spending a little bit more on inverter output capacity, and we got it down to an 8.3-year payback on a $45,000 spend. If instead we spent that on the Tesla Powerwall, which for the same budget would give us 4 Tesla Powerwalls, which would be only 20 kilowatts of output capacity, and would give us 54 kilowatt hours of storage. The payback is 9.3 years. So, there you have it. There are examples of when you're given the choice between buying a low-end lithium-ion $200 kilowatt hour storage capacity versus a higher-end lithium NMC battery that costs a lot more money but has a quicker discharge rate. In terms of which can produce better paybacks, it really comes down to which kind of spiky load are you trying to level. And if that spiky load is incredibly spiky, which is like we see for this building whenever their electric heater kicks on, it's a load that is really less than 2 hours a day. Let's go back into the winter time and take a real good close look at this spiky load. Let's see, it's starting right around 5 a.m. to 5:15, and then it's over by 6:15. So it's a 1 hour load or less. And so I guess that's the kind of question, the guidance is if you're going after electric load profiles that are 1 hour or less than 1 hour, which might be a 15-minute power down process. It might be a cloud shutting down a solar array and coming back on again, or it might be an industrial process that uses a tremendous amount of power for a short period of time. Going with lithium ion battery or lithium NMC batteries makes sense, even when the demand charges aren't sky high, simply based off you trying to net target a very peculiar spiky load. If you are seeing more plateaus, if your peak load is carrying out further than 1 hour into the 2.5 hour range, the Tesla, the lower end lithium would then become a better deal. And then at that point, it becomes a question of, is the building representing a substantial hazard to human health and safety, like an apartment complex as opposed to a warehouse? That might steer you towards lithium iron phosphate as opposed to entry level lithium. And while the payback would be longer term, you'd also be getting a longer lasting battery out of it. And then so now I want to show you, kind of go through what I've been able to build in a spreadsheet to kind of replicate that software value. I'm not as concerned about making CFO friendly cash presentations when I'm just beginning kind of the design process. So while I think, commercial solar design software often results in a very good value to the solar designer, I also understand, that for the purposes of continuing education and also for the purposes of not just spending a bunch of money on a bunch of software fees, that it would be nice to know how to kind of start getting a rough estimate on what you could do yourself with it. And so, as you'll be able to tell from this presentation, the problem is, crunching all this data is actually a computer intensive process. And so what I've done here is I've taken my interval data and I've taken my PV watts data, and here I have a demand toggle so I can change up my solar array size. And then I have I subtract the two. I take my building demand and then I subtract it with solar. And now, that's showing, hey, there's a time frame when, my solar array is pumping back 12 kW back onto the grid. And then I have a demand target size of 51 kW. And so effectively, I have a graph that says if my new building demand is less than, no, if my new building demand is greater than my target demand, then make the building demand my target demand. And then after that, I subtract out the energy difference between the new building demand and the old building demand. I say, okay, well, in order to make that happen, I've had to take out X many kilowatt hours from my battery. And so, and that was for the first attempt. And so for the second attempt, the big difference is that instead of having a target demand of 51 kW of demand reduction for the entire year, I recognize that different months have, if you can set different demand thresholds for different months, then you can achieve greater demand reductions during your off-peak months and less demand reduction during your peak month, but you can start breaking it out by the month instead. And so, the spreadsheet model is not as good because it kind of assumes you're going to be using the highest end, most responsive battery systems, when in fact there are physical limitations to lower end lithium cobalt, which is that it just has to do with the shape of the load. 2.5 hours or more, low end lithium cobalt is going to be where you want to be at. That's LG Chem and Tesla and Panasonic. When you get into spikier loads, then you're going to be seeking out specific battery manufacturers and saying, hey, how about that lithium NMC? You got it in your supply chain yet? I think lastly, there's a question. Well, what about disposal of these batteries and solar arrays at the end of their life? And the simple answer is there's not much out there. There's a couple of companies looking at it. There's more bad news rather than good news. The bad news is that the longer lasting the battery is, the less damage that can be applied to the battery over the life of it. Well, eventually that battery does get damaged. And a battery that's very hard to damage is very hard to undamage too. So even if you're not trying to resurrect the battery and refurbish it and bring it back to life, what you can do with some unsealed batteries by applying high voltage charges to them and busting those barnacles off of the anodes and getting a little more life out of it. The sealed batteries can't take that level of agitation to begin with, and the kind of barnacles that grow on a high-end lithium NMC battery are tougher than what will grow on a lower-end lead acid, and that makes recycling all the more difficult. So lead acid industry has actually used this as a selling point. They say, our batteries are actually more recyclable than lithium ion. And the lithium ion battery industry is so new that I'm not sure that there's much right now that's built out for recycling of these batteries. So it'll probably get the put it in the attic treatment that old CRT monitors get. It's not a good thing, not really a good thing to be throwing away, but also difficult to recycle. Okay, so the we're kind of running towards the end of our program. Uh, I guess what I'm gonna we have some time to burn, and so I'm gonna just kind of extrapolate on some commercial solar design issues since this is a commercial solar class. Um, let's see, I'm on a blank slide here. So one common design mistake to watch out for, and this is kind of free topic. So if you have additional questions, this is a good time to ask them. But one design mistake that I have done myself is on a commercial building, you'll often have a knife switch disconnect on the side of the building that'll initiate rapid shutdown procedures. So here's our knife switch disconnect. And that might connect to, an electric service panel that is on the other side of the wall. I guess I'm not as good at scribbling out, electric service panels, but let's just real quickly, just call this real quick. You know what? I'm going to use my pencil pen tool to draw this out. Got your electric service panel, down here, and conduit of some nature in between them. Utility lines either come in from the ground or they come in from overhead. And a solar array on top of the rooftop, if here's the roof and your conduits are coming down into this disconnect switch, it's very tempting to bring that in through the top of the switch because that's where the solar array is. And it can also get confusing because the solar array is a source of power supply, and you may be doing it on a supply side connection. So the question is a solar array a line or a load? When it's grid tied, fed directly into the service, if the solar array were standalone and there weren't even a load on site, would it be considered at the point of grid connection to be a line or a load? And so the mistake is you got two terminal blocks at the top and the bottom of this disconnect switch, and the disconnect switch moves a blade between the two. And so the question is, where do you land the solar side and where do you land the utility side? Which goes on the top and which goes on the bottom? And it could be very tempting if this power is coming through the bottom of the panel up here and the top of the panel up here to land the solar array on the top and the utility on the bottom. But that's actually a mistake. On an electric service panel, the utility feed, the feed that is always live, the feed that is always hot, is going into the top. And then the disconnected load, when solar loses that utility connection, it disconnects. That feeds into the bottom. And the reason for that is that when this service panel opens up and you actually get to access the inside, you can work inside the bottom of this panel while staying away from the top. But if you reversed these items, if you landed the solar array at the top because it's coming in from the roof, and you land the grid feed on the bottom because it's coming in from the ground, what's going to happen is if you ever want to work inside this electric service panel, you're going to have to power down the facility because that feed makes it so that you can't work inside that box. The bottom side is more exposed to the worker than the top side. And then there's a slight element of you don't really want to enter through the top of the box or even the top side of the box outside. You want to enter through, the very bottom or the very bottom on the side because of rainwater issues. You'd rather those penetrations be where the water is going to drip out of the box, not where it's going to get into the box. Okay, and there is a question. Would you be willing to share your spreadsheet you've used? Yeah, I'm more than happy to share these resources. I also publish the videos to YouTube and my website. So if you just send me a quick email after class, then I'll send you the link. You can also just visit my website, which is community.solar. I usually upload the latest program a couple of days after. It's kind of as a thank you to get this information resources better distributed to you. This class is paid for by your registration, so I try and make my programs open to Halfmoon customers as a result of that. And with that, we are at the end of our program. So I'm going to pass it back to Halfmoon.
All right. Well, thank you very much, JR. As well, thanks everyone for attending this afternoon. Remember that your quiz is going to be sent here to your email shortly. And then once you've successfully completed the quiz, you'll have access to your certificate. If you don't pass the quiz right away, you'll be able to retake it until you do receive a passing grade. With that being said, the series has concluded. If you do have any questions for myself or Halfmoon, you can go ahead and use one of the emails that have been sent out to you to contact me, or you can call our customer service. I'll also be more than happy to pass along any questions for Mr. Cromer. And with that being said, we are done. Again, thanks everyone, and thank you, JR. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your day.